Good evening and welcome back to the 2022 McDonald Center Conference. We're delighted to have you this evening. Last night we had a wonderful talk by Professor Oliver O'Donovan, Statues. We are delighted this evening to hear from Professor Nigel Biggar. Professor Biggar, as has been said several times throughout the conference, is retiring as Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology. And so this will mark his final public address as the chair holder. So we're very honored to have him tonight. We'd like to thank those who have sponsored the conference, the McDonald Agape Foundation and Peter McDonald for their support and generosity for it, and also Providence Magazine for their support. There will be a reception afterwards, so do stay around for that, which is sponsored by Providence Magazine. As we did last evening, well, not quite as exactly like last evening. Last evening, Professor Biggar introduced Professor Oliver O'Donovan, and tonight, as I mentioned, the roles are reversed. So I'd like to welcome the previous holder of the chair, Professor O'Donovan, to say a few words about Professor Biggar.
It's my very great honor to introduce to you, if the word is not absurd, the Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford, a title one has only to pronounce to evoke that dreamy historical pomp with which this university has loved to surround its very ordinary academic avocations. A figure to whom a title buried in rich historical associations, the brainchild of Lord Melbourne, Victoria's first Prime Minister, who was, believe it or not, eager to bring good governance to Oxford's most scandal-ridden college. What's new? The first Canon Professor does not seem to have found this a very burdensome task. His name was Charles Ogilvie, and at the same time as being Professor, he was Vicar of Ross-on-Wye in Monmouthshire, and at the same time chaplain to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and all in all was believed to be the richest clergyman in the Church of England. The second professor, Edward King, had the additional burden of being judged a saint. Quite a problem. I have actually preached on his festival, and that was quite a problem. King was reputed for preferring going round Tom Quad hearing confessions, mainly by the other canons' housekeepers, to reading German theological literature in the style that he was expected to. The sixth occupant of the chair, Kenneth Kirk, is probably the one most people have heard of. He shocked Christchurch by refusing to live in the house he was given, with the very unreasonable argument that it needed a king's ransom to make it habitable, and he didn't happen to have the money. Kirk won that battle, as he won most of his battles, and every canon professor since then who has been given a house fit for human habitation, or just, has been grateful to him. And Kirk was also the first in this line of professors to write books on a serious scale and sell them on a serious scale. You could count how many he sold in Oxford's second-hand bookshops when I was a student, walls covered with them, having finally been offloaded by the clergy of the Church of England, dead or alive. And so to our 12th professor, Nigel Biggar. The latest, and I think as we will have picked up from all the things that have been said today, not the least glorious of the line. Not as pluralistic as Ogilvie, to be sure, nor as priestly as king, nor as pugnacious as Kirk, but well capable of standing his ground on any of those fronts when challenged. Nigel has solved once and for all the problem of how to be a pluralist without having to commute constantly to Ross-on-Wye and Canterbury, two of the hardest journeys to do even today in the south of England, simply by bringing his second role, that of director of the McDonald Centre, right here to Oxford, and fulfilling both roles at once. And none of us at this conference need persuading, I think, of the way that Chair's activities have been mightily reinforced by this magnificent innovation. His books, if not sold in quite so many copies as Kirk's were, are, I think, much more widely discussed, and, if I may dare without lèse-majesté to say so, much more worth discussing than Kirk's were. And if he's not been quite so upwardly mobile as some of his predecessors, 4 bishops and 2 deans slid noiselessly out of this chair into higher responsibilities. He is the first professor of moral and pastoral theology to have taken the chair precisely where it obviously always belonged, namely to Buckingham Palace, and to attract the sovereign's notice in the honours list. And if he's not matched the 30-year tenures of Ogilvy and Otley, marked by the publication of 1 sermon in the first case, and 1 book in the second case, he comes in a decent 5th for what we call it durability and hardware. And those who love solid and stable things are more than grateful for 15 highly productive years in this chair. The main thing is that now they're coming to an end, Nigel, there are plenty who will wish that they could have been a bit longer. The good news is that they're not over quite yet, since we have this afternoon's McDonald Distinguished Lecture to look forward to, with its surely very personal title, Honour the Fate You Are, Reflections on Christian Realism. So let us listen to Professor Nigel Biggar.
Not sure that's that good.
Yeah. We have to choose between, or maybe not, I thought we had to choose between my being able to see my text and you hearing my voice, or not hearing my voice and my seeing my text, but I think we got the right height here. So I could spend a lot of time at this point thanking a lot of people. I'm not going to do that now. I will do it at the end of the conference tomorrow. So I withhold thanks at this point and will proceed with my lecture. Assuming you beach at last near Atlantis and begin that terrible trek inland through squalid woods and frozen tundras where all are soon lost. If forsaken then you stand, dismissal everywhere, stone and now, silence and air. Oh, remember the great dead and honour the fate you are, travelling and tormented, dialectic and bizarre. Stagger onward, rejoicing. And even then, if perhaps having actually got to the last col, you collapse with all Atlantis shining below you, yet you cannot descend, you should still be proud even to have been allowed just to peep at Atlantis in a poetic vision. Give thanks and lie down in peace, having seen your salvation. Those who conceived this conference, and I wasn't among them, chose to do so in terms of vocation. They gave it the title, Faithful to the Call. They also illustrated it with Caravaggio's The Call of St. Matthew, a painting electric with drama. And they did that without knowing, I think, that I discovered that painting for myself in Rome 3 years ago when playing truant from another conference. I discovered it and it's kept me spellbound ever since. So vocation is the general theme given to our meeting, and in what follows I will be guided by it, and I will look back upon the development of my own vocation, confessing it, explaining it, and, I hope, justifying it. So what I have to say is at once a confession and an apologia. The themes of realism in two senses, and of movements upward and downward, will recur. Now, like any ordinary sinner, I am, no doubt, inclined to find myself inordinately fascinating. And as a self-conscious sinner, I am therefore shy of pressing myself upon you. Not too shy. But of course, it is never the bare self that is of interest at all. What's of interest is the self in response to the call of what's true and good and beautiful, and to God's efforts to rescue and establish what's true and good and beautiful. So what's of interest optimally is the self as an icon of higher things. And it may be that as I tell my story, things more important than me will shine through and speak. I open my remarks with a quotation from W.H. Auden's poem Atlantis. We heard from Auden through Chuck Matthews earlier. I'm so glad he quoted from another poem. Since Auden spent several months in the winter of 1972 and 3 living in the former brew house that backs onto the garden of the Southwest Lodgings here in Christchurch, where I and Ginny have been privileged to live for the past 15 years, I've taken to reading Auden again for the first time since I was in secondary school. Much of what he wrote, frankly, has made no lasting impression, but some certainly has, not least Atlantis. Written in 1941, shortly after he had rediscovered his Christian faith, it amounts to a Christian odyssey, as envisaged by the narrator, who is about to embark on a voyage to the Isle of Salvation. I can't demonstrate it, but it does seem to me that Atlantis bears the marks both of St. Augustine and Reinhold Niebuhr. Certainly Auden had read the former and knew the latter, and the combination of frank realism and transcendent hope certainly echoes them. Stagger onward, rejoicing. But the lines that have struck me most are the ones immediately preceding. Honour the fate you are, travelling and tormented, dialectic and bizarre. In every vocation there is a large measure of fate, or rather fate is the raw material of a vocation. One responds to a call out of a situation that is given one. My situation was that of Britain in the late 1950s and early 1970s. It was a situation of national humiliation. I was born the year after the Suez Crisis, and I grew to political consciousness during the 1960s, when Britain's fall from global preeminence was being writ large as the Union Jack was ritually lowered in one country after another as Africa literally decolonised. In the winter of 1973, I was in my very first term as an undergraduate reading history at Worcester College here in Oxford. Huddled over the desk in my room in the dark morning hours, I was straining to prepare for my first set of exams by candlelight, since the electricity generating stations had shut down, their fuel supply cut off by striking coal miners. My tea was not sweet as I preferred, since the dockyard workers were also on strike and imported sugar was impossible to find. The radio was heavy with news about the latest bombings and shootings in Northern Ireland, where the violence was then at its height, and the London Times was running a series of leading articles under the title, "Is Britain Governable?" Like everyone else, except perhaps for those on the hard left, who were gleeful about the revolutionary opportunities of economic and political chaos, I was anxious and concerned. And as a recent convert to Christianity, I wondered what on earth my newfound faith had to say to such a national crisis. 3 years later, the crisis had relaxed a bit, but the political strife rumbled on. I was then in the final year of my undergraduate studies, and I had opted to take a specialist course in the life and times of St. Augustine, in which large tracts of the City of God were prescribed in Latin. In Augustine, I found another Christian who was trying to make sense of turbulent times in which the known world seemed to be falling down about his ears. Nothing in the history curriculum had commanded my attention as did this. 15 months later, in September 1977, I started my first theology degree at Regent College in Vancouver. But my fate was not simply the circumstances in which I found myself. It was also my response to them. I felt the sense of national humiliation personally, and the political turbulence alarmed me. This was not a necessary reaction. My elder brother Tony, may he rest in peace, reacted in the opposite direction. He found the revolutionary prospects rather attractive and exciting. So exactly why I reacted the way I did, I have no idea. I didn't choose it. It was given me. It was my fate. Accordingly, when I applied to enter the PhD program at the University of Chicago in 1980, the very first sentence in my application read, and I quote, "My study of Christian theology is fundamentally motivated by the desire to make a critical and constructive contribution to the post-imperial British social and political enterprise." So that I wrote 42 years ago. My interest in Christian theology has never, therefore, been simply academic. From the very beginning, it has been driven by a persistent desire to reach the position of being able to address, with Christian integrity and practical wisdom, important issues facing this country. And I will confess the proper name of this desire, patriotism. I say confess advisedly because throughout my life I have been acutely aware that in the educated middle-class social circles of my generation, patriotism has been regarded, and is still regarded, as embarrassing. Since I began to describe myself as a British patriot about 5 years ago, I'm aware that I've never heard any other Briton, since my parents' generation, say that of themselves. I'm aware that were friends and colleagues in Oxford and elsewhere, politically centrist with a leaning to the left, to hear me talking in this way, there would likely be a sharp intake of breath and a sucking of teeth, a mental stepping back, as if they just encountered something diseased. I've been aware of the uncoolness, even the dodgy reputation of patriotism among members of my own class and generation for all of my life, which is why I've suppressed it. I've always felt it, but rarely expressed it directly, because I assumed that everyone else must know better. However, older age, I have found, confers a dangerous combination of two benefits. First, one finally knows what one thinks. And second, one worries less about how other people will react to it. So I now say what I've always felt. I confess the truth. I am a British patriot. I honour my fate. However, although a fate is bound to shape a vocation, Although a calling must always address someone embedded in a particular set of circumstances, a Christian may not assume that everything that is given by God. For there is always the possibility that fated affection, however strongly felt, is distorted by sin, driven, say, more by pride or anxiety than by love of what is true, good, and beautiful. As Auden candidly put it, the fate we should honour is still travelling and tormented, dialectic and bizarre. Consequently, we Christians have to test, always test, what we have received. And that's what I've sought to do when I first began to reflect concertedly on a Christian ethic of national loyalty. I had to admit that my country, like every other, is indeed an artificial construct. It is man-made. It is not divine and eternal. My country is not God. In that respect, my Christian patriotism is quite distinct from the romantic nationalism that makes of the nation a substitute of God and claims that by investing oneself wholly in the nation's life, the individual achieves a kind of immortality. That's the view immediately visible in the 18th century thought of Fichte, who wrote, "The noble-minded man's belief in the eternal continuance of the people from which he is developed, of the eternal continuance of the people for which he is developed, the noble-minded man's belief in the eternal continuance of his influence even on this earth is founded in the hope of the eternal continuance of the people from which he is developed. In order to save his nation, he must be ready even to die that it may live." Given the patently idolatrous character of this kind of nationalism, Karl Barth was rhetorically correct, in the shadow of its infamous Nazi expression, to refuse to record the nation any special status at all in the eyes of the one true God, as he presents it in volume 3-4 of his Church Dogmatics: national communities or peoples dissolve into mere neighbours near and far. Therefore, in spite of the fact that in the run-up to the referendum on Scottish independence in 2014, as a self-conscious Anglo-Scot, I lost several nights' sleep worrying about the possible breakup of the United Kingdom. I had to admit that it was possible that the UK should break up. The UK is a human construct which was invented in 1707, and it could be that its time had come to an end, and that, like Czechoslovakia, it should disintegrate into its constituent parts. As it happens, I came to the considered view that Scottish separatism is a dogmatic solution in desperate search of a justifying problem, and that there are several very good reasons why the UK should stay united. But I did admit in principle that that need not be so. I have honoured my fate, but I have sought to do so as a Christian critically. In order to reflect critically upon patriotic affection or visceral bottom-up conviction of any kind, one has to first have moral criteria to apply. And in order to be authoritative, these criteria cannot be invented. They must be given. They must exercise a certain external obligatory force, bearing downwards, as it were, upon the sinful human agent. Here the dogma of Christian monotheism asserts what the phenomenon of human conscience intuits. And it seems to me that during the moral meltdown of the 1960s, what attracted me to Christianity was in no small measure its moral realism, the belief that there is a given, created, real moral order of moral ends and principles that dignifies human beings with responsibility, endows their actions with moral significance, and gives their lives the shape of a moral adventure, a moral odyssey, one might say. So it wasn't long before my postgraduate study of Christian theology at the University of Chicago took a decisively ethical turn, mainly in terms of Karl Barth. I had encountered Barth before at Regent College, Vancouver, where I'd taken a class on his Doctrine of God in Volume 2 of the Church Dogmatics, taught as it happened by Klaus Bockmuhl, the father of Oxford's current Marcus Bockmuhl. My initial encounter with Barth was not a happy one. Indeed, so frustrated did I become at Barth's convoluted style of thinking and writing that at one point I tried to rip up the volume and I threw it across the room. Now, those of you who know the tomes of Barts' Dogmatics will understand that the attempt was in vain. The 800-page tome, slightly battered, still sits on my shelves, smirking. Nevertheless, when at Chicago I took Jim Gustafson's locally famous seminar comparing the architecture of the ethical systems of Barth and Aquinas, I became keenly interested in the question of how a comprehensive theological framework should shape a vision of moral life. And since his ethics are deeply rooted in an extraordinarily integrated system of Trinitarian theology, and since they trace the ethical implications of an incarnational Christology with unequaled tenacity, Barth was an obvious master at whose feet to sit. Yet it wasn't only the theological comprehensiveness of Barth's ethics that attracted me. It was also what I will call his spirituality, by which I mean his emphasis on the relationship between God and human creatures. It's one of the salient features of Barth's ethic that this lies at its heart, and it's for that reason that I've always thought it very apt of Stephen Sykes to suggest that we view Barth not only as a formidable Calvinist dogmatician, but also as a spiritual writer. As Barth has it, at the very beginning of all that we do, and remaining basic to it, is prayer. The importance of this is that prayer is the basic condition of human freedom and gladness. When the human being acknowledges God, the Creator, Reconciler, and Redeemer in prayer, she is freed from the intolerable burden of coping with her finitude by trying to shoulder divine responsibility. She's freed from guilt of her past sins, and she's freed from anxiety about the future. In prayer to the triune God, the human being is free to be a creature who has been graciously reconciled and will be sanctified at the end of history. Through prayer, she grows the virtues of humility, faith, gratitude, and hope, which enable her to flourish in the only way a sinful creature can. Prayer is the first and the last thing that we should do. It's basic to an ethic that takes God seriously as a living reality to whom human beings can and should relate in a personal way. It's also basic to an ethic that recognizes that before we turn to the business of deliberating about how we should conduct ourselves in the world, there is the prior task of contemplating what kind of beings we are in the first place, and what is the context in which we are set. Prayer embodies and confirms a theological view of the agent's self and of her location. This feature of Barth's ethics has always seemed to me one of its greatest virtues, and it still does. It endows thinking about moral matters with an existential seriousness. The ethical task is not just and not primarily about our solving practical problems out there in the world. It is first and foremost about coming to terms with a true theological and soteriological description of our own creaturely nature and sinful condition, and of our standing before a benevolent, forgiving, and saving God. It's about adopting a posture and a set of dispositions appropriate to our nature and situation, on our knees, humble, grateful, hopeful, and glad. It is about positioning the ethical problem solver before he sets about solving the problems. So through Barth, my Christian faith moved me to subject the bottom-up fate of my visceral patriotism to the government of a top-down, thoroughly theological moral realism. It moved me to train my fate into becoming a vocation. However, although I was a disciple of Barth's for over a decade, from the early 1980s when I was a doctoral student until the publication of my book on Barth's Ethics, The Hastening That Waits, in the early 1990s, I was never a devotee. I wanted to learn from him, not to worship him. I entered deep into Barth world in order to measure myself against it, not to dwell in it. So while much of what I learned I've carried with me ever since, even before I had finished my book, I became aware that its interpretation of Barth's ethics had at certain important points become a reconstruction. And when 15 years later, in 2008, I looked back from a more mature intellectual vantage point in an essay entitled Karl Barth's Ethics Revisited, it had become quite clear to me that my reconstruction had been more expressive of where I thought Barth should have gone than of where he actually went. And in that essay's conclusion, I was frank about what of Barth I had jettisoned, namely, and I quote, the conception of apprehending what's right in terms of hearing a command of God, the proposed division of labour between theological ethics and practical Christian ethics, and the reluctance in practice to negotiate with non-theological sources, end of quote. Yet the feature of Karl Barth's thought that I found most unsatisfactory is the indeterminate way in which his theologically generated ethical concepts often hover frustratingly above the concrete earth of complex moral and political problems, and the haphazard manner in which he sometimes leaps from theological premise to moral rule or concrete judgment. Probably the most notorious instance of this was the set of analogies he made in his 1946 essay, The Christian Community and the Civil Community, between Christian dogmatic tenets and ethical positions. To take one example, Barth tells us that, and I quote, since the Church lives from the disclosure of the true God and his revelation, it follows, as an inevitable political corollary, that the Church is the sworn enemy of all secret diplomacy. We see here the dogmatic premise. We see too the ethical conclusion. And we hear the assertion of logical necessity binding them together. What we miss is the moral analysis of different kinds of openness, articulating what is good about God's revelation of himself to human creatures, explaining why this is analogous to the open publicity of diplomatic negotiations, and thereby demonstrating what's wrong about secret diplomacy. As it stands, the corollary is not only a long way short of logical necessity, it struggles to command respect. Therefore, in The Hastening That Wait, I criticise Barth, alongside others, for rejecting the careful, rational, dialectical negotiation between moral rule and case that is casuistry, and I sought to show that Barth himself practiced it covertly. My criticism was informed by my discovery, at least a decade before, of the Anglican tradition of casuistry that began with William Perkins and Richard Ames in the 16th century and was briefly revived by Kenneth Kirk in the 1920s. And I think, Oliver, that Kirk was the person who had the title of the Regius Chair of Moral Theology made into the, Regius Chair of Pastoral Theology made into the Chair of Moral and Pastoral Theology. He added the word moral. 4 years before The Hastening That Waits appeared in 1989, I sought to trace the fortunes of this Anglican casuistical tradition in the very first article I had published in a mainstream academic journal, which was entitled A Case for Casuistry in the Church. And in that article, I explicitly invoked Kirk in support of a dialectical kind of casuistry that doesn't merely apply moral rules to cases in a top-down fashion, but negotiates between them in such a way that the former may sometimes be educated and refined by the latter bottom up. Quite why I find myself so drawn to casuistical reasoning, I'm not sure. Perhaps it was just a certain intellectual circumspection or fastidiousness, a natural tendency to want to see things worked through thoroughly. But I strongly suspect that it also had to do with my long-standing fascination with history, which was and remains my first love. The study of history introduces us to the stories of real human beings as they struggle to navigate their way through circumstances that are often complicated, messy, and not easily tractable. Equally, more than often than not, they are circumstances that the human agent did not choose for himself. As Joseph Chamberlain, British colonial secretary, commenting on imperial policy in South Africa in the year 1900, said, "We have to lie in the bed which our predecessors made for us." 3 years ago, these words echoed in my mind as I climbed the modest mountain in the Italian Apennines, where my mild-mannered father, rudely plucked from the rolling hills of southwest Scotland in his early 30s, had found himself playing stretcher-bearer on the Gothic line in the bitter winter of 1944. He would have nodded his head grimly, as would many in Ukraine today, at Leon Trotsky's menacing aphorism, You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. We must often lie on the bed that others have made for us. Exposure to history confronts us with this fatedness, this being plunged into alien and adverse circumstances, having to fight wars we would never have chosen. And in such circumstances, the meaning of moral principles is often not as obvious as we thought, and we're forced to reflect on them and think hard about whether or how they fit the case. For one example, take this. In September 1998, I organised a conference here in Oxford at St Anthony's College under the title of Burying the Past, Making Peace and Doing Justice After Civil Conflict. The so-called Good Friday Agreement had been reached in Northern Ireland. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa was about to publish its report, and in the former East Germany, the Stasi files were being made available to the informed upon, who were learning the identities of their informers. When I walked into the conference, I assumed that the rule that we should forgive our enemies could be applied to these cases more or less straightforwardly, and that the meaning of the concepts of forgiveness and reconciliation were clear. But then at one point, up stands Ulrike Popper, a Lutheran dissident who had been twice imprisoned by the communist authorities in East Germany. And she said, "What's all this talk about reconciliation? I now live on the same street as the man who informed on me. I didn't know him then, and I certainly don't want to know him now. What do you mean, reconciliation?" It was this testimony from an unfamiliar set of circumstances that provoked me to rethink what I'd taken for granted about forgiveness and reconciliation and their political applicability. In particular, it led me to conclude that when referring to a political as distinct from an interpersonal context, it's usually more appropriate to talk more modestly and reservedly about accommodation than reconciliation. The full embrace of the prodigal son so memorably depicted by Rembrandt, which may be possible between formerly estranged intimates, is often too much to expect, not even appropriate, after political violence. At a subsequent McDonald Centre conference, I think in about 2013-14, in this room, which we held under the title of Is Christian Forgiveness Immoral? One of our speakers from Denmark showed us a photograph on the screen there, taken during a Gakacha or community trial held in Rwanda after the 1994 genocide. And in the picture, you have two men standing in a circle of people. One man is about 6'5" and the other is about 5'6". One of them slaughtered the relatives of the other, had slaughtered the relatives of the other. The good news, the remarkable news, is they are standing within 6 inches of each other. The not so good news is that the tall man's looking up there and the short man's looking down there. They cannot look each other in the eyes. They cannot embrace. But they are standing next to each other. They're not quite reconciled, but they are mutually accommodating. And under those dreadful circumstances, actually, that's no small achievement. As I argued in a case for casuistry in the church, the traffic between moral principle or rule on the one hand and case on the other is not always one way. It is sometimes dialectical. The moral principle enables us to begin to come to grips with the case, and if the case fits the paradigm that the principle assumes, as Kenneth Kirk pointed out, then its prefabricated grip is sufficient and the case is solved ethically. But if the case has morally significant features that don't feature in the paradigm, then the prefabricated grip will not fit, has to be reflected upon and adjusted. So here, casuistry is not simply the mechanical top-down application of moral rule to circumstances, but rather a conceptual negotiation between them, whereby the rule is educated and refined bottom up. Take another example. Suppose a Christian ethicist is thinking about the ethics of the use of violent force in terms of the doctrine of just war. From his general theological education, he'll know that love is a Christian virtue, and in the light of the example of Jesus, he might assume that love should always take the form of compassion. From his reading of Augustine and Paul Ramsey, for example, he will know that love must always motivate and discipline war, if it is to be just, that is to say, if it's to be justified. And from his wider reading of the just war literature, he will know that one of the standard features of a justified decision to go to war is that there is a reasonable prospect of success. Suppose then that one evening our ethicist lays down his copy of Augustine or Vittoria and takes up Barry Pitt's history of the Battle of Alamein in North Africa, when the British Commonwealth scored its first major victory on land over Nazi Germany in World War II. And he comes to page 396, where he reads of a briefing conference held in the middle of the battle, in which Major General Freyberg communicates General Montgomery's orders to Brigadier Curry, commander of the 9th Armoured Brigade. And this is what Pitt describes. The task for 9th Armoured Brigade to advance past the infantry objective, break through the enemy defences, and immediately beyond the Rahman track, and then hold open the gap against enemy counterattacks until the heavy brigades of the 1st Armoured Division had gone through, was so obviously one of difficulty and danger that when Curry's time came to make comment, he rather diffidently suggested that by the end of the day his brigade might well have suffered 50% casualties. To this Freyberg had replied with studied nonchalance, perhaps more than that. The Army Commander Montgomery says he's prepared to accept 100%. Now, this account of a particular moment in North Africa in October 1942 reminds our ethicist of other reading he's done in military history, and it gives birth to the unsettling thought that one of the conditions of military success is a commander's possession of a certain kind of callousness, not toward the enemy or toward civilians, but toward his own troops. A successful commander has to be willing to order soldiers who may be close personal friends to fight to the death. And in order to do this, he has to be able to distance himself from the human consequences of his decision, to literally callous himself against them. And that's what Winston Churchill observed of General Douglas Haig, who commanded the British Army on the Western Front during the First World War. And I quote, "He presents to me in those red years the same mental picture as a great surgeon before the days of anaesthetics, intent upon the operation, entirely removed in his professional capacity from the agony of the patient. He would operate without excitement, and if the patient died, he would not reproach himself." But then Churchill adds, "It must be understood that I speak only of Haig's professional actions. Once out of the theatre, his heart was as warm as any man's." History then teaches that a certain kind of professional callousness is a condition of military success. Just war doctrine requires that military success be possible. The logic of just war doctrine therefore appears to make a certain species of callousness a necessary military virtue. But can callousness really be a Christian virtue? Our ethicist reflects on his conversation the previous evening with an actual surgeon and on his own experience of heading a university department in the wake of severe cuts in funding. And he realises that all sorts of social roles require well-intentioned human beings to make decisions and perform acts that will foreseeably hurt other people, and that in order to make and do them, they have to grow thick skin. They have to callous themselves. Thus, observing that callousness need not involve a culpable lack of care or a failure to love, our ethicist finds himself brought to the novel conclusion that it can be a Christian virtue. Had he not picked up a history book, however, this would never have occurred to him. So as I put it in my 2015 article in Providence magazine, and I quote, "Less Hegel and more history, please, if Christian ethics is going to do justice to political and military reality, and so deserve a hearing from policymakers and decision takers." Partly out of my respect for the moral significance of circumstances, but mainly because of my education in history, I have become sceptical and critical of the way in which, it seems to me, Christian theologians and ethicists often try to grasp the world through abstractions, which, unrefined by contact with the world's angular realities, carry with them a host of dubious moral prejudgments or prejudices. Some years ago, for example, I noticed that some young Christian ethicists emerging from US universities were much impressed by the Republican philosophy of Philip Pettit, and were therefore wont to assume that domination is an intrinsically bad thing. Now, in one sense, since Pettit stipulates that domination means arbitrary rule and enslavement, they couldn't be faulted because it is indeed by definition wicked, like torture or rape. But the problem arises when Pettit's disciples proceed to assume that anything in the real world that involves hierarchy or coercion, that is, one person dominating another, is necessarily an instance of domination as stipulated and therefore immoral. If one comes to this line of thinking, as I do, from intensive study of the history and ethics of war, then it seems obviously wrong-headed. For surely we want the police to dominate the mafia, don't we? And we want those fighting in a just cause to dominate those fighting in an unjust one. The same problem arises, it seems to me, when Christian theologians and ethicists talk about colonialism. Following fashionable post-colonialist literary theory, they assume this to be essentially racist, oppressive, exploitative, and violent. But those assumptions are simply not sustainable in the face of any honest encounter with the historical phenomena of empire. In the final chapter of Between Kin and Cosmopolis, I took the New Testament scholar Richard Horsley to task on this. I do not doubt, I wrote, that Jesus' teaching and conduct had and has political import, nor do I wish to quarrel with the claim that he was critical of Roman conduct. What I do resist, however, is the representation of the politics of Jesus and of his earliest followers as anti-empire. It's telling that at one point Horsley refers to empire with a capital E. What this indicates is that he thinks that all actual empires share the same basic nature, that empire always and everywhere means essentially the same thing, tyranny. I think this is wrong. I think that empirically, historically, empire can mean significantly different things at different times and places. Indeed, if the British Empire is anything to go by, then empire can mean significantly different things at the same time in different places. And when I say significant, I mean morally significant. Unlike Horsley, I don't think that empire is always and everywhere unjust, nor that nationalist resistance is always and everywhere just. One must judge case by case, first looking at what's happening and only then formulating a judgment. When we do that, we will often find a moral complexity that crude talk of imperialism and anti-imperialism glibly passes over. Without bracing, sobering contact with empirical and historical reality, abstract concepts too easily become the vehicles of fashionable and, to my mind, wrong-headed prejudice. So my casuistical bent has been generated partly by intellectual fastidiousness, partly by an historical awareness of the moral force of circumstance, and partly by a suspicion of the moral assumptions built into abstract concepts. But a fourth motive has been a respect for non-academics and a pastoral concern for them. I'm aware that I opted for an academic career partly because I have a certain personality. Quite cautious, wanting time to observe and reflect and work things out, unwilling to decide until fully ready, careful to cover and protect every angle, averse to risk. At least I was. Such a personality develops a characteristic set of virtues, of course, but it is not well suited to making momentous and risky decisions under intense pressure. I have a great deal of respect, therefore, for other people no less intelligent than I, who have chosen, or been fated to choose, careers and roles that are heavy with frontline responsibility and light with the leisure to reflect. I sympathise very greatly with those whom Reinhold Niebuhr nicely called the burden bearers of the world. So when, in his critique of my 2013 book In Defence of War, the scholar of international relations Cian O'Driscoll wrote that just war theorists like me are inevitably part of the war machine, that we're trying to constrain, and that we therefore stand in danger of coming so close to the flame of power that we get burnt by it, I protested. I do understand what Kean means. Institutions do acquire a momentum of their own, sometimes perverse, that is hard to stop, and well-meaning individuals need to take care lest they get carried away. Nevertheless, it struck me that where Kean saw a machine, I saw faces. The faces of friends of mine in public office, who are, I think, more morally reflective and sensitive than the average citizen, humbler, less sanctimonious, and who have shouldered responsibilities and taken risks that academics like me have chosen careers to evade. It's widely recognised among academics that remoteness from the exercise of executive power yields the important advantage of critical distance. What is less recognised is that it also occasions a grave temptation, a temptation to relish too much the self-flattering role of righteous prophet, to indulge in wishful thinking, to daydream among the what-ifs, and never to grasp the necessary nettle. It seems to me that Christian ethicists ought to acquaint themselves more with those in public office, become familiar with the burdens they bear, learn to appreciate the constraints under which they operate, and enter with them imaginatively into the tragic dilemmas they have to face. Then, having taken the trouble to exercise their love in playing pastor, the ethicists will have learned the right to play prophet. I believe that Augustine would have approved. During that life-changing undergraduate course I took about his life and times 47 years ago, I wrote an essay on Donatism. In it I quoted a passage from a letter of Augustine to Paulinus of Nola, which so deeply impressed me that I kept that essay to this day. Here it is. The only other thing that strikes me about this is that my handwriting has got even worse. The passage I quoted was this: "On the subject of punishing or refraining from punishment, what am I to say? It is our desire that when we decide whether or not to punish people, in either case, it should contribute wholly to their security. These are indeed deep and obscure matters. What limit ought to be set to punishment with regard to both the nature and extent of guilt, and also the strength of spirit the wrongdoers possess? What ought each one to suffer? What do we do when, as often happens, punishing someone will lead to his destruction, but leaving him unpunished will lead to someone else being destroyed? What trembling, what darkness! Trembling and fear have come upon me, and darkness has covered me. And I said, who will give me wings like a dove's? Then I will fly away and be at rest." Quoting Psalm 55. But Augustine did not flee. He did not run away. He continued to shoulder the responsibilities of bishop, which as the Roman Empire crumbled around him, were increasingly those of government. He kept up pastoral correspondence with military tribunes like Boniface and Marcellinus, whose Christian consciences were troubled by what they had to do. With them, he lamented the tragic dilemmas of political life, but he did not flinch from facing them. As it were, he staggered on, rejoicing. And note, none of this prevented Augustine from developing the prophetic critique of the Roman Empire that became the city of God. He stands therefore as a shining example of one who took the risk of coming close to the flame of power and yet was not consumed by it, of one who risked playing pastor and yet could still play prophet. So, faithful to the call, renewing theological ethics from the ground up. Well, the fate of deeply felt affections and anxieties, welling up mysteriously from within, are the raw material of a unique vocation. But these must yield to the testing and correction from above of created moral reality and the salvific work of God before they qualify as a vocation. And then the downward movement of generic moral principles and specific rules needs to be tempered by humility, docility, and love for human flourishing, so as to respect circumstances and yield to the upward thrust of their moral authority. From the ground up, from heaven downward, and from the ground up again. Thus will Christian moral realism, propelled by visceral affection for one part of God's world or another, learn to do justice to angular human realities, and so deserve the respect of the burden bearers of the world. Thanks very much.
I think we can all be grateful for this evening hearing Biggar on Biggar, which is Biggar on the vocation of the Christian ethicist, and Biggar on the way in which one Christian ethicist, namely himself, sought to honor the fate he is and honor the vocation to which he was called. So thank you, Professor Biggar, for that. We do have some time to engage Nigel in some questions or reflections. And as we have been doing, Stephen will run a microphone around, so if you would like to respond in some way, throw your hand up and we'll move into some Q&A in response. This time.
Thanks, Nigel, for that witness, I would call it, not only a lecture. I wanted to ask you about callousness as a virtue. Because I understand that we shouldn't be sucked up by anxiety that is around us. But it doesn't mean that we should be insensitive. And I think that there's a polarity between being callous and and being anxious. So we should not choose one over another. We should have a polarity that is fruitful and makes us human beings. And so this is one take on that. And if you wanted to answer that question, I was wondering about the role of callousness and warm heart in the work of Professor.
So, callousness and?
Warm heart. Yeah, so not only about soldiers having warm heart, but also professors.
Thanks, Michal. Obviously, to propose the virtue of callousness is provocative, because so in English, callousness, by common definition, is a vice. It's insensitive when it should be sensitive. So I think when I've written about this, I've actually talked about callousedness. So etymologically, a callous is just thick skin. Now, it seems to me what I learnt from reading about that passage of history, and also just reflecting on what people in responsibility often have to do, it does involve, I mean, one may be aware of the pain one's going to cause someone, but one should not be so aware of it that you can't make the right decision. And that sometimes you therefore have to become sufficiently insensitive as to make the decision in spite of the fact you know you're going to cause them pain. Now, as it happens, General Haig in the First World War, early on, I think in the Battle of the Somme, he started to visit field stations to visit the wounded. The experience made him so distraught, his staff forbade him to do it again because he simply wasn't able to function as a general. So it wasn't that he was insensitive, but in order to make decisions of that kind, now you know, if you're a pacifist, this is you shouldn't have been doing it in the first place. But if you're not a pacifist, and if you do think that war is sometimes justified, then that is the kind of decision that people in a certain position of military responsibility have to take. But as I try to suggest, there are also analogies where if you're a surgeon and you don't have anaesthetics, or if you're a manager and you have to dismiss perhaps a close colleague because of wrongdoing, or because he's being made redundant, and you know the damage it will cause, but you have to do it. So I guess I'm very willing to find another name for it, so it doesn't sound quite so provocative or counterintuitive. But and maybe particularly in an age when, in my more reactionary moments, it seems to me that compassion is the only virtue. The only virtue. We need a bit of prudence to temper it, and just remind people that actually sometimes you need to be tough enough to do things you know will harm people. So that was your first question. And as for the warm heart and a professor, I mean, even a professor has to tell some students they failed. Well, well, you have to be willing to fail students you love, or to tell a student that, or to tell a former student who's applying for a job that they're not fit for it. So you have to be willing to disappoint them, make them really unhappy. That's all I want to try and assert. So whatever word we call it, we need to name it because it is part of virtue, I think.
Thank you, Nigel. That was a wonderful paper, and I'm grateful for the vulnerability you showed in it, and for what you shared. It was really powerful. The one notion that you mentioned a few times that jumped out at me was the notion of fate. And certainly there are obviously things in our lives that are givens, our parents, our family, where we grew up, and so forth and so on. But fate seems to be a lot stronger of a notion than that. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that and how you understand that theologically.
To some extent, I took my cue from Auden, the word he uses. And I although as a Christian, I believe that fate is the providence of God. I don't want my faith and hope in God to obscure the fact of the givenness and constraints in which we find ourselves. I mean, these are God-given, but let's be clear, we are thrown into them. We are faced with wars we never planned to fight, which transport us from the rolling hills of Galloway to wartime Italy. So I think the word fate is a bit, providence sounds a bit kind of soft, maybe even pious. I believe in it, but I don't want to soften the force of fate. That's all. But yes, as a Christian, I do believe that what is given by God, and therefore I'm called to serve God in these circumstances as best I can. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I also wanted to say something about callousness. I'm sure you're right to say that to succeed in certain roles, you do have to cultivate a certain callousness. I thought that was a very interesting and insightful point. But I'm not sure that I agree with your conclusion from that, which is that callousness is therefore a Christian virtue. I would say that these are roles in which it's just not possible to live a fully Christian life. I mean, of course, that doesn't preclude you from the possibility of salvation with God's grace, but you can't radiate the light of Christ as a general or a magistrate or that's the conclusion I would draw. But I'd be interested in your thought.
Okay. So Edward, you spend a lot of time thinking about virtues, so I take what you say seriously. Okay, you can take the position which sends you in a rather and a Baptist direction, that because positions of responsibility of this kind require a certain thick-skinnedness, shall we say, a certain targeted insensitivity. Therefore, the Christian can't perform them. Now, that's a not unreasonable position to take, and many Christians have taken it.
Fully Christian life.
Fully. I see. Fully.
I mean, to be a Christian, but...
Hang on, so are you saying that, okay, so, okay, does anyone on earth live a fully Christian life? Well, so I guess you could have a situation where, as it were, real Christians avoid these things, but so they're the kind of elite, and I guess that would be the Mennonites. They're representing the kingdom of God as it's coming, and the rest of us, I don't know. The rest of us have to keep the world going. I mean, you can take that position. I guess I find it. My complaint then is that those Christians who feel themselves called to represent the kingdom to come and therefore to eschew involvement in any kind of coercion, for example, are depending on the rest of us to get stuck in and to keep things together. It seems to me to be, I think it seems to me to be irresponsible, actually. Yeah.
I'd like to ask perhaps the converse question. If callousness, could we gloss callousness as severity? But if callousness, or whatever one wishes to call it, is a virtue, is it in some sense an imitation of God? Is it necessarily in some sense also an imitation of Christ? Is it an imitation of God but not an imitation of Christ? Would any of these be required for it to be, properly speaking, a Christian virtue?
Okay, so one challenge you pose to me is can this be an imitation of Christ? So someone's saying yes? Well, maybe you can answer the question. I'll answer the question, maybe then you can give a better answer. I'm just trying to give examples where Jesus does or says things to people that need to be done or said, but which is actually painful to them to hear. I mean, well, certainly, heavens above, poor old Pharisees. I mean, Jesus spoke truth that they needed to hear, but boy, did it hurt. Was he callous? I mean, that sounds counterintuitive, but was he severe? Severity? Yes, he was certainly very severe. And maybe to be severe, but maybe to be severe, you do need to avert your eyes, as it were, from the pain you're about to cause. I don't mind. I don't mind what you call it. It has to be done. Does someone have a better answer about Jesus? No. Okay.
Christian.
Thank you. Nigel, you said that you had come to accept and declare your patriotism after suppressing it for a while because other people weren't open to those kinds of affirmations. But I understood you to say that you rejected nationalism. And I was just wondering, I mean, I know conceptually these two have different traditions and we can separate them in theory, but I was just wondering how in practice, how easy is it for us to separate those two, to be feeling patriotic, say, rather than nationalist? Are the Ukrainians today patriots or nationalists? And how easy is it to distinguish? Because we do often feel the need to make that distinction. And we do, many of us feel, yes, patriotism good, nationalism not so good. And I just wonder how easy it is in practice to make those distinctions.
Thanks, Christian. I mean, everything depends on what we mean by them, of course. So yes, nationalism carries a negative connotation. I think it, as I suggested, I can clearly distinguish between what I call Christian patriotism and romantic nationalism, right? So a Christian patriot cannot regard his country as divine. So that would be one difference. Yeah. Though, I mean, yes, I mean, there are some Scottish nationalists who want to recover the word nationalist from any pejorative sense, but I don't think it matters what you call it. As for Ukraine, I mean, often a sense of patriotism or national affection is reactive. So it's when people find that something they care about is being threatened that they suddenly find they have something in common to defend. And that gives rise to a strong sense of national identity, as clearly President Putin is achieving in Ukraine. Yeah, so I guess I would, insofar as nationalism connotes a kind of divinization of the nation, a kind of exclusive loyalty, a rejection of the sense that the nationalist or the nationalist nation has any responsibility to other peoples. I mean, that for a Christian is completely unacceptable. Yeah.
Very back corners.
Thank you. Could you address the role of the church in providing healing for those who have experienced moral injury as a result of their actions taken on behalf of the state? And I don't include like army chaplains because they're kind of a unique category, but sort of the church outside of the institutions of, say, the military.
Stephen, yeah, my mind immediately thinks of military examples, but let me try and pursue that. But I'm effectively abstracting from my thinking about this in military terms. And Mark Lebecki and I have talked about this. Sometimes a sense of moral injury, to my tidy mind, arises from a failure to make distinctions. So sometimes people feel guilty for having caused destruction when, under tragic circumstances, it was right that they should cause destruction or damage or pain. Sometimes, as I've already said, I think it is right. One may be even morally obliged to do something that causes pain, and you may feel that even though you do it because you've calloused yourself, you may still feel, at least afterwards, a certain doubt. You may agonize, you may feel remorse, you may feel psychologically confused. So you may feel as if you've kind of compromised your integrity. So one thing, well, my kind of church would say is, in some cases at least, no, what you did was right. The circumstances in which you were placed were tragic. Would that you didn't have to do what you did, but what you did was right. We should all lament the fact you had to do it, but you shouldn't feel guilty about it. And that's one thing the church might say. I'm not sure that my church would say that, but I think it should.
Chris Landau.
Thanks, Nigel. I was intrigued that you mentioned prayer, and I wondered, as you look back, whether you think that Christian ethics as a discipline takes prayer sufficiently seriously and thinks about the role of prayer, at least potentially, in forming an individual's moral response, let alone the response of the church more corporately.
Well, I think insofar as Well, it depends what you mean by seriously, Chris. In theory, we take it seriously. That's to say, if we read Bart, or if we read Hauerwas, the importance of acts of worship in forming moral character, and actually before it's forming moral character, it's more, as I said, about the sinful human creature assuming an appropriate disposition as this kind of agent. And both Bart and Hauerwas have been very much in the bloodstream of Christian ethics in recent decades. So I think insofar as we take our cue from them or learn from them, yes, we do take that seriously, at least in class.
Thanks for this, Nigel. I was thinking, and I may bluster it into my jet lag fog here, of Niebuhr's famous line of equality of sin and equality of guilt as a way of analyzing the human condition and on the ground. I wonder what you think about that, and particularly given, I was thinking during Patrick's talk of shalom bioethics, which struck me as what political theorists might call forward-looking theories of justice versus backward-looking theories of justice. Your call to history seems to want us to do both, but there's been a turn to think about responsibility, moral responsibility, for things for which we should not feel guilty about. How do you analyze that phenomena? Responsibility without guilt.
Eric, can you give me, typically, if you give me a concrete example, then I'll know how to think about it.
Well, I was thinking of Bart's claim that he shares in the sins against Africa.
Against what?
The sin against Africa.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I see.
Slavery.
Yeah, okay.
Colonialism.
Yeah.
This is going to be a softball question. It's a concept Hannah Arendt invokes of collective responsibility without guilt, without shame, but a recognition of some kind of complicity or responsibility for changing the situation. It's a kind of realism that is on the rise, I think, in academic political theory. I don't know about in Britain.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes, it may be that our predecessors did things they should not have done that have affected the world badly. We aren't responsible for what they did, but if the bad things they did continue to adversely affect other people, then if we have the power, all other things considered, we should aid those people. So, for example, with regard to slavery in the West Indies, I'm not persuaded that one can draw a clear line of causation between slavery 2 and a bit centuries ago and the present state of certain parts of the West Indies. So one can establish, as it were, a debt of guilt. But what I'd say is, because of Britain's historical involvement in that part of the world, because Britain is a prosperous and wealthy country, when it comes to making allocations of aid, the West Indies and other parts of the world like them should be our priority. We can't save the whole world. We can save parts of it, and that's one reason to help that part of the world. But trying to establish guilt 2 centuries back, it's too far away. I think that the lines of causation are too diffuse, and so much has happened in between then. Not, in the case of slavery, including a century and a half of imperial anti-slavery endeavour worldwide. Yeah, and yes, I mean, reading both Honora O'Neill and Jeremy Waldron on trying to sort out the wrongs of the past. I think both of them come to the conclusion that better, as it were, for those who have the power and the wealth to address present problems elsewhere, let's sort out the present problems. The question of to what extent present problems are our fault for what we did two centuries ago is often too difficult to sort out. But by all means, if it's a present problem and we have the power to help solve it, let's do that. So it's more, as it were, present and future oriented and less trying to sort out the lines of responsibility for the past, often. Unless you have a case, for example, the obvious case of Germany after World War II, where the line of responsibility between the German state and the seizure of Jewish property was much shorter, and so you can establish lines of responsibility of victim and perpetrator more easily.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I will freely admit it was not exactly what I was expecting. And I was expecting to ask you a question about Bart's actualistic ethical paradigm. But instead, I found you being vulnerable enough to us to share your life's work and perspective. So I have a different question for you now. For those of us who retain the confidence and are in the inner circles of those who find themselves in positions of high political power and influence, who are themselves Christians and don't have the luxury of operating from a deontological Christian ethical perspective, but to a certain extent have to toe the fine line of recognizing that they might have to pursue courses of action that they would rather not in order to prevent future wrongs or achieve a greater good. How do those of us who might call ourselves Christian minister to those people in our lives? And how do we retain our own sense of God's calling and our understanding of what our ethics are in light of the duty that they, to a certain extent, have by fate inherited?
Okay, although assessing consequences is often part of practical reasoning, I'm not a consequentialist. As a Christian, there are principles and there are rules, and although rules should be sensitive to circumstances, they're still rules, and therefore there may be some things that Christians in positions of government simply should not do. So you started off by saying, for those of us without a kind of deontological dimension, and I have to say, as a Christian, you can't do that. Which is not to say that we shouldn't think very hard about, what does the rule really require in these circumstances? Because, as I suggested, oftentimes it's not immediately clear, and the meaning of the rule has to be worked out. That is not to say you throw the rule out. You've got to think about what it means here. But it may mean sometimes whatever would appear to be the consequences, you may not do it. The classic example is the just warrior who, if the just warrior cannot fight a war justly, a Christian just warrior may not fight it, and must join the pacifist on his knees and pray God to protect what he can't, or to find some other way of trying to protect what can't be protected by military means justly. So there's always, as it were, a deontic bottom line somewhere.
And with that, I think we will close out the evening. So please join me in thanking Professor Ryan.